I mean, to be sure, we are going to need all the help we can get in the years ahead. If AI can help us, then, bring it on. And we need that. So I guess where would the regulatory come from? Who framework come from? Who would build it? Who would be part of it? Jillian, you know, what's your take on that?
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this challenge, actually, I'd say for a couple of decades, because we've been seeing pressure on our existing regulatory framework for decades with digitization, the speed of innovation, globalization. Our existing regulatory frameworks are built on, again, we built those up during the 20th century. They were well adapted to the mass manufacturing nation state-based economy. So we definitely need to think about those new approaches. And one of the things that I think is critical for us to do is to combine two tools. One is outcome-based regulation, so regulating for outcome. So we've already seen this shift in pollution regulation, for example, shifting from telling factories what technology must you install, and saying, okay, here's the level of emissions that you have to reach. You figure out the best way to do this. So that's pushing that decision about how to achieve the target, achieve the outcome into the company. But the outcomes are still politically set. They're still set by our politically accountable bodies, legislatures, and so on. The second tool is markets. And I'm a big fan of markets, not for any ideological reasons, but because they're really good at solving problems. And this is a massive problem, as you're noting. How are we going to regulate the speed, the complexity, the global nature of AI technologies? So a model that I've written about in my book, and also recently in a paper with Jack Clark from OpenAI, thinking about in the AI setting, is something I call regulatory markets. So this is an idea. Can we create a layer of competitive regulators, private regulators, companies that are investing in regulatory methods and technology, but regulate those regulators by having governments set the outcomes that they have to achieve? So if we did this in the context of self-driving cars, it's a very simplistic version of regulation but you have a politically determined, what's the acceptable accident rate on the highway? Okay, so now I may be a private regulator that says, oh, you know what, I've got a set of rules I think I could implement. And the companies that would have to buy they'd have to buy regulatory services, I would create a regulatory regime. Zia might say, you know what, I've got a way to do some technology for that. I've got a machine learning based model that will regulate the vehicles. And Zia and I both have to demonstrate to governments we achieve the target outcome, but now we're competing to maybe provide you, if you're the manufacturer of the self-driving vehicles, you're choosing between the methods we are proposing for achieving those outcomes. We both have to achieve the same outcome, but we are investing in figuring out better, more effective, more adaptive, rapid ways of achieving that. So I think there's a way for us to use those tools to get to this more adaptive, agile form of governance.
Am I hearing you correctly when you say that the regulatory framework would be governmental necessarily? It wouldn't be business entities. It would be governmental bodies.
That's right. So the problem we find ourselves in today is our tech companies that are building the AI, right? They hold all the cards, as you're noting. They've got the technologies. They know what's happening. It's hard for us to see into that. Governments are facing a very hard time keeping up with that.
Right.
So we've seen this thing, okay, either we have this blunt force government regulation, or we leave it to the companies to regulate themselves. This is trying to find something in between that says it's ultimately under the control of our government bodies, so it's politically accountable, but we're trying to harness the capacity for markets to go out and find better ways to accomplish the goals we're setting. So it's still under government oversight, absolutely.
Zia, who would be the regulators in your view? What governmental bodies, or would it be business?
Well, I actually am a big fan of Jillian's model here, and I think there's a slight analogy. It's a little different, but when you think about insurance, which was the government sort of sets a standard that everyone needs to have insurance, and then you can shop around an insurance market. There's some kind of like loose analogy to that. So ultimately, government will have to set the rules for what are the social outcomes, that we want. That is a political process. And right now we have private sector companies that are in essence setting those rules. And whereas they were comfortable with that rule setting before, they're growing increasingly uncomfortable. And we see something like Microsoft, which is now not selling facial recognition technology to police departments because
Right.
they want to force the government to come in and set the rules and the norms because it's out of the scope of what they want to are able to or should be focusing on.
Mhm.
So when it comes to what goals and what outcomes we need, that has to be something that's set through a political process, and government is best set for that. But the mechanisms, and I think unlocking the innovation, that can be a private sector activity as well.
I'm not sure I heard you correctly. You're saying government is not set for that, or is set for that?
I would believe that government is set and the only entity that can set the outcomes that we are trying to regulate towards. And then how those regulations develop, there I think you can start to develop an entrepreneurial market approach.
And what sort of entities would staff that entrepreneurial market approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. And
I,
that's something that we at Rockford are pretty keen to experiment with. And I think this is
okay.
one of the roles of foundations, is we can kind of help with that R&D and initial supporting innovation across some specific use cases.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're very interested in looking at specific problems and trying to think about, okay, what are some innovative models to help solve this particular problem? So I
Okay.
don't have an answer right now, but
Yeah.
it's something that we're looking forward to discovering.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think about the job market. I don't mean displacing jobs. I mean, I was talking to someone about they knew of an AI expert. He or she was really advanced and had business skills and was literally earning $1 million a year. And I'm sure that's a rarefied individual. I'm sure most AI experts are not earning that kind of money, but I'm sure they're probably earning a couple $100,000 a year or more. And there's a growing cohort of those professionals. I don't know how many government professionals earning that much, or $500,000 a year, and it seems like some of the AI experts would be able to run circles around some of their lower paid counterparts. But again, I'm being slightly cynical. I
Well,
guess the question, yeah, please, Jillian, thank you.
I was going to say, 'cause that's actually why I think it's really critical we get this into a market sector,
Okay,
so that you have your government actors who are setting outcomes. They're
right.
saying, how robust algorithms have to be, or that they can't be biased against particular groups, or the accident rates for our self-driving vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually do want to create precisely in order to attract the money and brains you need
Mm-hmm.
to develop smart regulation, and that includes smart regulatory technology. I always say you're going to need AI to regulate AI. So I want to think of it as, I'd like to create a market opportunity for those young engineers or whatever inside our big tech companies to spin out and say, okay, I spent 5 years building this technology inside Google or Amazon or Microsoft. I know how to regulate this stuff.
Okay.
And I want them to have that market opportunity to get venture capital, to attract other players to that. So it's to get that energy of innovation into the because for exactly the reason you point out, which is we can't regulate entirely through the public sector. We have to regulate the outcomes there. We got to set those outcomes, but we have to let a market entity figure out how to get there, because we have to attract the money and brains needed to that innovative activity.
So you're almost talking about a cohort of tech startups that and their business
Yes,
would be AI regulation?
absolutely. In fact, I've spoken to companies that are starting to get into this space. We already have a very large compliance industry, for example. So if
Okay.
you have to comply with banking regulations, lots of tech companies out there providing you with software to help you comply with our very detailed banking
Right.
regulations.
Definitely.
So this is really just move this up one level. Instead of banking regulators telling you precisely what kinds of authorization you have to open an account, or what your customer rules are.
Mm-hmm.
Tell them, okay, you have to get the probability of a money laundering transaction down below this level. You figure out how to do it, and you sell that service to your customers. Governments tell the companies they need to buy regulatory services. Governments regulate those private companies that are providing those regulatory services, but you try to create an active global market in that regulatory activity.
So are there actions that concerned professionals can take, whether someone's maybe an advanced tech professional or an AI expert, maybe works for a company? Would you give any advice to that person if they wanted to help out in this process?
Sure. I mean, I think one of our aspirations is when we look at the data science community, and we did a little bit of ethnographic studies of like what motivates them and what drives them.
Mm-hmm.
And there really is a growing consciousness around data scientists where they're starting to realize that the products they're producing aren't just like winning chess games or things like
Right,
that, but they have like
right,
actual meaningful impacts.
right.
And so we believe that there'll be a raised consciousness in the same way that you have doctors have a raised consciousness about what actions they have impact
Mm-hmm.
on people in society. Same with the legal profession. I think there'll be a professionalization of data science that raises the social consciousness, and that'll be a force that we can harness. We're already seeing it in a lot of the large companies, large tech companies, who are responding to their employee concerns as much as others. So in terms of what specifically someone can do, I think there's a lot of resources out there to just understand what are the kind of frameworks of how to think about ethical development, and to engage with their management, to engage with their companies around how do they think about the unintended consequences of their work, how do they think about choices that they can make, and just create some of that internal pressure within companies. Companies themselves have business reasons to be interested in this. Civil society has reasons, government has reasons. And that's something that we're excited about, is we're seeing lots of people who are aligning to this notion of we need some form of governance. We just don't know exactly what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's important. Uh, I'd like to look to the future, but before I ask the two of you to look to the future, I invite our audience, if you have any questions, please ask them now. We welcome your questions and your input. So Jillian, what do you think? If you look in your crystal ball, and we're sitting here in the year 2025, which sounds like a very exotic year, but it's actually not that far from now.
It's very close.
It's like 48 months from now or whatever. I don't know how long it is. I'd have to use my calculator to figure out how in COVID time, right? So how we're having this conversation in 2025? Are we going to say, shoot, it didn't happen, or it did happen? This is how it went, or how is it going to go? What do you foresee happening in terms of AI and regulation in the coming, say, half decade or so?
Well, so I see two possible paths. One is that we don't address this problem, and what we see are just the exacerbation of the inequalities and power and so on that we're seeing now, and we see the blunt force instruments of we're just going to ban this stuff because we don't trust it and we don't like it. So I think that's one not very happy future, and that's what I think happens if we don't solve this problem. I think, again, I'm back to the optimist, and I'm also out here selling ideas. So I'm going to be optimistic and say I'm going to believe I can sell these ideas, because I am absolutely confident there are paths forward where we get to smart regulation that harnesses the power of AI and allows it to become part of our regulatory environment so we can continue to shape our future as humans. I think there's some reason to think that we are on that path. In the last year, we've started to see the shift from the call for fairly abstract guidelines and ethical principles, all of which is very good, to a recognition we need to start building the concrete regulatory mechanisms. And that's what via and Rockefeller and Schwartz-Reisman, and also with the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, we're starting on an initiative to say, look, okay, let's start thinking about how we'd actually build those regulatory. Don't just call for governments to write new laws. Don't just call for engineers to be more ethical. It's a solid regulatory challenge. There are ways forward on that. So I'm going to be optimistic and say that's the path we're on.
I like the sound of that. Zia, what's your take? If you look into your crystal ball for the future, what are things going to be looking like several years from now in terms of AI and regulation?
Sure. So I believe what you'll start to see are, some countries or states who actually figure out how are we going to make sure that AI is a good infrastructure that helps us serve our society on health and education, and also creates interesting market opportunities. And just in the same way that the states figured out how electricity could help in that way, and how the internet and broadband helped in that way. And so I think there'll be these positive examples out there that'll start to become more and more common, and that people will seek to replicate more and more. We're seeing some examples of that. This isn't exactly the same, but when it comes to digital ID, The countries and the states that are able to create a real digital ID system are seeing so many benefits from that, that more and more people then look to them. So I think 5 years from now, we'll be hopefully past the state of just those initial little examples, and there'll be more and more a common and systematic approach of how do we, whether it's, some of Jillian's ideas, like unlock these markets for regulations, but it'll be more and more common. I think it'll be more and more of an expectation.
Well, I'm gonna like keep my fingers crossed for the more optimistic view. I like, in particular, the idea that the data scientists would have sort of a social consciousness. I think that's entirely possible. We certainly hope so. I want to thank the two of you for sharing your expertise today. I certainly learned a lot. It was a great conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James.
Thanks, James.
All right, take care.
Bye.